Well, first of all, I don't think there's much day-to-day business over $2 billion. I think that's borne out. You found one example in Orange County. We've identified 3 or 4 other ones. And so in sort of perspective of the state's overall financing, budgeting, infrastructure projects is an exceedingly small amount. That was intentional. Again, the federal government steps in. I'm not making this up. This is in federal regulations and statute that pays for the lion's share of disaster response. 1989 earthquake, the Congress made a specific, immediate multi-billion-dollar appropriation to address the Loma Prieta earthquake. Speaker Foley brought the Congress back into session and did that. So that's how this works. We have history bearing that out. It's really not quite as, I think, is going to be as disruptive as some have stated based on history and practice in the past.
Well, if you recall, if you saw it in the Treasurer's testimony, he distributed a document, which if you don't have, we'll give you a copy of, says state agency revenue bonds. And he lists revenue bonds of various state agencies totaling $31 billion and conduit financing totaling $26 billion. Was it your intention by this measure? You see, some of the big hospitals that exist around the state, was it your intention to require a statewide vote for, say, a hospital in San Diego, for people in Sonoma to have to vote for that?
Well, are you talking about a private hospital or a public hospital?
Private hospital.
Well, that's not a project owned, operated, managed by the state. That's a private hospital.
But the financing comes through the Health Facilities Financing Authority, which is authorized by state measures, and it is a revenue bond by its very nature. That's what all these things are. In other words, we have this wonderful mechanism to reduce financing costs that the Treasurer talked about, and it seems to me that I'm just asking you, is it the intention of this measure to affect those transactions?
I would refer you to the language of the measure that says a vote is required for bonds issued by the state.
Yeah, they're issued by the state. That's what the Health Facilities
for any project owned, operated, or managed by the state.
Okay, or their partner. Well, the question is issued by the state.
Yeah. So it has to be both. It has to be both, not just one. It's not a project owned, operated, or managed by the state.
Well, I got to tell you something. I know your interpretation. I think what the Treasurer indicated, we'll move on, but what the Treasurer said is that what concerns him as somebody who interfaces with a very sophisticated market is that this creates uncertainty. You sit here as a young lawyer and testify before this committee as if you're the Supreme Court and say this is the way it is. The fact of the matter is we're in a situation where this creates, we're looking at this and creating uncertainty in a very sophisticated marketplace with very sophisticated folks who are extremely conservative about risking other people's money. Please.
Yes, I think we've had constitutional changes in the past that have impacted the state's financing or budgeting ability. I mean, everyone knows about Prop 13. Someone mentioned Prop 218. We have Prop 26. We have Prop 39 on school bonds. All these measures, constitutional measures, changed the rules for state financing of projects of all sorts. This is a continuation of that. The world didn't end in 1978 when we had Prop 13, or 1996 when we had Prop 218, or 2010 when we had Prop 26 either. We're all still here today. California's still here today. There's no. I just don't know why this would be the aberration, which really has much less sort of of an impact on the state's finances than those measures, and many others that I could continue to cite to you.
Can I just correct you a little bit here, because you just talked about owned, operated, or managed by the state. It says for any single project, financed, owned, or operated. You forgot the most probative word that Colin indicated.
Yes, so that's being financed.
That certainly includes revenue bonds. Wouldn't you say that's correct?
That would include revenue bonds, but those revenue bonds, as I think was stated, are repaid. They're being financed by the hospital as paying them back, right? I don't want to belabor the point, but
yeah, of course, but it's okay. Financed. But it's financed, authorized through a state agency, authorized by the state, issued under the authority of the state.
Yeah,
it's no question about it.
And again, it would have to give her $2 billion. $2 billion. So that's a practical barrier to many projects.
Just one You want Senator Bell has a question, but let's ask one final question. I was going to get into the issues with respect to the energy crisis, but I think we'll have some witnesses here that can talk about that, Mr. Secretary, because of another circumstance where we face some perfect storm, an emergency that you seem to just brush off as if it doesn't seem to matter and it's not a problem, but we had to live it.
Well,
and so, but the notion is that. Does your office do municipal bond work?
No, we're not bond counsel like Orrick or like Meyer Brown or anything like that. So no.
Okay, yeah. So all I was going to suggest to you is that in these refundings or these pooled deals, there's a tremendous number of $2 billion transactions that the state is using in an effort to try to save taxpayers money, okay? And we don't want to talk about it now. I don't need to go into it. The purpose of this hearing, I think, is to, and I'll turn to Senator Bell, is just have an honest discussion about all these issues and raise them so that we can bring them to public light and hopefully engage you in a thoughtful conversation that says maybe you can do this in a better way. Maybe there's something you can achieve your objectives and there's unintended consequences here that we just didn't think about, that putting all these minds together can be thoughtful and help you in proceeding. Senator Bell.
I'm going to focus again on my disaster issue. The statement that FEMA money is available for 75% of the cost. I know in Washington, D.C., there's a lot of controversies about FEMA and about the funding of FEMA. It appears that there's some people who think that FEMA funding, giving money to states to fund the cost of the governmental entities in state and local government is being challenged. Is that the case right now? Are there people that would like to change the relationship with FEMA and local and state governments? Senator,
I really can't comment. Not because I don't want to, but because I really don't know what's going on in Washington, D.C. and with FEMA and Congress.
Well, you said that they would.
I just know.
You said that they would give us, if there was a disaster, 75% of the money.
That's what the law requires today. That's all I can comment on. That's what the law and regulation requires.
75% of all the cost of a disaster, or some of the cost?
All public infrastructure damage, and it's a minimum. That's a floor of 75%, not necessarily a ceiling.
Now, there also is the investments in bonds to mitigate or prevent disasters. We recently got a report saying the California Water Project, the aqueduct, should be extensively repaired, correct? And we need to fix that before it's sheared by an earthquake or other kinds of subsidence problems, other structural problems. And we have that continually come up regarding bridges, other kinds of improvements that we have owned by the state or local governments. Now, when the Northridge earthquake occurred, there was an investigation of the FEMA response, and there was a report to Congress that said that we, in terms of FEMA, there was a hesitancy to do infrastructure repair projects to mitigate problems due to the fact that it was assumed that FEMA, if there was a problem, would reimburse the state and local governments. So waiting until, and that was a report of Congress, a congressional report investigation after post-Northridge earthquake. Yeah. It's rather interesting. I study these kind of things I study because I believe we should mitigate disasters by preventing them and repairing the, especially if somebody says like the problem is imminent. And I served on the Seismic Safety Commission. I know we have a lot of studies showing that there's many structures and public facilities that are in need of imminent repair. So would FEMA reimburse us for the pre-disaster cost of these facilities?
Some of the FEMA dollars after a disaster, they will not only repair the infrastructure, but provide dollars for prevention in the future. I'm
talking about
pre-disaster.
I do a bond now to prevent something like the California aqueduct from being ruptured, or say the levees in the Delta, which are very costly as well. There's other kinds of projects that we have been told specifically that these disasters, if there's any kind of major flood, earthquake, et cetera, could have some relatively high cost consequences. Wouldn't it be better to fund those prior to those disasters? I think we obviously would say yes, right?
Yeah,
would FEMA reimburse us for those costs?
I would defer to the experts at the Legislative Analyst Office on that. I mean, if they were here, I think they would reiterate that they've stated that this measure would only apply to relatively few projects. That's their words, not mine. But I would defer to them on probably the best way to proceed on that if they were here.
Are you aware of FEMA's controversies regarding the way they reimburse local governments? How in Texas, in Katrina, Sandy, et cetera, have basically denied a lot of reimbursements, and there's several controversies where they made reimbursements for, I would say, maybe questionable activities due to, how would you say it, political involvement to get the reimbursements from FEMA?
Sir, I'm not aware of all of the extent of those issues. Not something we can address in a state constitutional amendment.
Well, you're saying that 75% of them.
Yeah, that's what the law requires. So that's what law is.
But how do they determine the 75% is the question, correct?
Yeah, there's standards for that. I mean, the regulations set out the protocols and the requirements.
Okay, thank you. I think that what I kind of, having gone through FEMA myself, I was in City Hall during the 1989 earthquake, and unfortunately I had a corner office. So if you have a corner office during an earthquake, that's not a very fun experience. The books were flying from one wall and flying from the other wall, and I had to duck under the desk to avoid getting struck in the head and hurt by the books and other stuff. I had a bunch of knickknacks in the office, and they were flying all over the room like a storm. That's why I don't have those things in my office now. I don't have that kind of thing. But I think that my experience is that FEMA is rather rough sometimes on getting reimbursements. It's not just a flat 75%, and oftentimes they don't give you the money immediately. They delay the reimbursement. It takes a long time to get the money, and sometimes even interim financing is necessary to fund a response to disasters. But you don't know, when you do that, you don't know whether or not you're going to get reimbursed, actually. There's no agreement until they finally sign on the dotted line. Is that correct?
Well, sir, I don't think I can predict, how the next disaster in California, how FEMA is going to respond to it based on, what past administrations who are no longer in office in Washington, D.C. did, or what future administrations that are in place when the next disaster comes in California might be a lot different.
So if you think it's hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars in disaster cost, you think FEMA would give us 75% of that money?
All I can tell you is that's what the law requires. That's what the law requires.
Yeah, but you don't know what the reality will be.
We don't even know who will be in charge of FEMA when the next disaster comes, so I really can't comment on that.
Appropriates whether there's
and how much money do they appropriate on an annual basis to FEMA?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
How much money do they appropriate?
Congress?
Yeah.
Well, it's subject to congressional oversight. So that you'd have to tell me the year in which they appropriate the money, and that might be in the future.
The last 5 years, what was the average?
I don't have that information here, but I can get it for you if you'd like.
It's like 10 to $20 billion a year. So I think we got to look at possibly that 75% is a saying that is not based on my opinion. It could not be based on reality. So when you say 75% is legally required, that might not be what we really actually get.
And then you have the Federal Highway Administration covers transportation infrastructure, so that's under the Department of Transportation, different agency.
Right. So if we don't get what they say, the 75%, wouldn't we have to finance the remaining costs?
I suppose if they violate the law, that's a possibility.
Yeah. So no, if they don't violate the law, they just simply turn us down. That's what happens. They just say we're not going to cover those costs. That's the way it works. I mean, I've gone through it myself. I mean, I've done the whole FEMA dance, as I call it, with them, trying to get reimbursed for projects, and they actually turn down projects that they don't cover the full cost of the project. Okay, Mr. Chairman, I think that's worthy of looking into how FEMA behaves historically in California regarding this issue, and I think it affects. I think it would affect your statement about 75%.
Yeah, I think we'd welcome that research. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator.
Mr. Chairman? Chairman Gomez, any thoughts?
No, okay.
Okay. Just two final things before we close. Number one is we gave you the California 5-year infrastructure plan, the governor's plan that lists, $50-some billion in transportation, and this is 2016. And the thinking behind this is to give you some insights. Look, I'm a bipartisan guy. This is not about those projects. This is about responsible government. This is not about somebody who has an opinion on something, but you've got this unbelievably important established financial structure in place that reacts very dramatically to litigation, to uncertainty. Bond lawyers, will not opine unless there's certainty. They have very strict standards. I gave you the rules of the standards and sample letters of bond lawyers, not for only to be constructive, to tell you that this is a very sensitive thing, and that this uncertainty that you baked in, that you said will certainly result in litigation. I ask you, what's the impact going to be on bond prices? What's that going to be on taxpayers? What's the additional cost of delays and uncertainty and the like? These things are highly sensitive. What's your thoughts on that?
Again, Senator, I would defer to the legislative analyst's statement that this measure that in any case, there would be relatively few projects large enough to come under the measure's requirement for voter approval. I would defer to their statement, and I would also reiterate that in the past, we had Prop 218 and Prop 13 that revolutionized state financing, state and local financing, and the bond markets didn't crash. California was still able to move forward with
those
the
are
necessary
fundamentally
projects.
Different. We're going to talk about this with the witnesses, the impact of the economic feedback effect from Department of Finance on the underlying tax base for California, and look at some of the other issues here. And I ask you, please, to stay if you can.
Yes.
And listen to this, because the purpose of this hearing is for all of us to try to explore with the best minds possible, is this the best approach? And are there better ways to achieve your objectives? And are there unintended consequences that, despite the genius of the lawyers in your law firm, not everybody thought through? And that maybe we can add to that. So I ask you to stick with us. And now, if it's okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator and Chairman Gomez.
Thank you. Okay, now Secretary for Transportation Brian Kelly and Secretary for Resources John Laird. Sorry, gentlemen, thank you for your patience. I hope that at least the testimony this morning helped enlighten you as to the proponents' thoughts as we address their issues. And also, I guess, why don't we bring up Amy Acosta, Chief Deputy Director of Budget for California Finance, and Sandra Kim, Associate Vice President for Finance for the University of California. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you for your patience. You can start wherever you want to start.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Gomez, and members. My name is Brian Kelly. I'm the Secretary for the State Transportation Agency. honored to be here today and have the opportunity to testify before this body on the so-called No Blank Checks initiative. You've already heard a lot of commentary about from the State Treasurer and others about some of the initiative's impacts on financing and delivering infrastructure projects in California. I think I'm here today to articulate some of the initiative's impacts as they may relate to financing and constructing transportation infrastructure. I guess I would say as an overview, Mr. Chairman and members, that revenue bonds really act as a tool to help more efficiently deliver transportation projects throughout the state of California. They are common and widespread. It is a common and widespread practice for state and local governments to issue revenue bonds against dedicated revenue to finance and deliver transportation projects and deliver earlier their benefits quicker than if they were entirely paid for on a pay-as-you-go basis. So again, primarily, it is a tool to expedite the delivery of transportation projects and bring the benefits of those projects online sooner. Examples of major transportation projects delivered through the issuance of revenue bonds in California include things that many of you are familiar with. The Alameda Corridor project in Los Angeles is an example. The completion of the seismic retrofit program for state-owned bridges in California, and I would emphasize here that's not just about the reconstruction of the Bay Bridge, but that retrofit program involved statewide over 3,000 structures, and a public bond issuance was done to complete all of the toll bridge retrofit work in the Bay Area region, which involves 6 different structures. They've been used to construct toll bridges and toll roads all throughout the state of California, improvements and expansions to public airports. And I would say that revenue bonds have been used as a delivery tool for countless local projects funded in any of the 20 counties in the state with local sales tax measures dedicated to transportation improvements. I say that because revenue bonds are often utilized to deliver major projects as soon as possible. And as Senator Nguyen referenced earlier, there's a project along the I-405 in Orange County where revenue bonds are being utilized locally by that board, both against toll revenue and against measure money to deliver that project. Notwithstanding the long and comprehensive history of utilizing these bonds to efficiently deliver projects, the initiative under review today would generally reduce some of the state's flexibility to effectively deliver such projects. The requirement to return to statewide voters to approve the issuance of revenue bonds that are generally not backed by the full faith and credit of the state of California, will likely have the effect of delaying the delivery of large, meaningful projects in the state. Moreover, this requirement runs counter to recent policy approved by 2/3 of this legislature and enacted into law just last year to expand the use of pricing to fund improvements on the state highway system. AB 194 by Chairman Frazier, the Assembly Transportation Committee, authorized the expanded use of tolling to improve performance on the state highway system. The bill required Caltrans to work closely with local transportation entities to cooperatively develop the project scope and apply to the CTC for approval to proceed with the project. Once approved by the Commission, the project may proceed with the local entity and Caltrans working cooperatively on project scope, schedule, and cost. The project approval process is subject to several public hearings, including at least one conducted by the CTC at the site of the project and additional hearings by the local transportation authority. The legislation authorized the issuance of revenue bonds against the project's toll revenues to pay debt service for the construction or the improvement of the project. The legislation makes clear that these revenue bonds must contain on their face a notice stating neither the full faith and credit nor the taxing power of the state of California is pledged to the payment of principal of or interest on this instrument. Simply put, the legislation authorized the use of revenue bonds issued against tolls paid by users of the facility to deliver the project as early as possible, subject to public hearings and approvals at both the state and local level. While this recently enacted bill authorized the state to issue revenue bonds to help deliver these projects, the initiative we're discussing today would compel requirements adversely affecting project delivery. The initiative would require a pause in project development so the question of issuing revenue bonds could be placed before statewide voters at a statewide election. As the treasurer mentioned earlier, the revenue bonds may be less appealing to investors who would have to evaluate the bond certainty while awaiting election results. And I think one of the most perhaps unintended consequences is people living in the state of California far from the project's location, with no familiarity of the project, its history, or its approval process, would be asked to vote on the financing for the project even though their tax dollars are not at risk and the project does not affect their community. Simply asked, does it make sense for folks in Eureka to vote on the delivery of a project in Los Angeles? I recognize there's a $2 billion threshold in the initiative to trigger the statewide vote requirement, so I would simply note two things for the committee's consideration. The first is revenue bonds that were issued more than a decade ago to complete the seismic retrofit work of several state-owned bridges were valued then at about $1.2 billion, would be valued now in today's dollars at between $2.2 and $2.5 billion. Secondly, I would just note there are sizable projects on the horizon, like a proposed truck lane on the I-710 in Los Angeles is one example that is expected to cost more than $2 billion. Because that facility could be tolled, revenue bonds may be a good option to deliver the project earlier than waiting to pay for it on a pay-as-you-go basis. Finally, I would observe that the initiative's failure to include an exception to the statewide vote requirement in the event of an emergency might hamper the state's ability to respond quickly to such an emergency. With that, Mr. Chairman and members, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Why don't we, if we could, to make it efficient, I just would like, if you could all, is that okay with you, Senator Pavley, just have everybody testify? And the only thing I want, if you could add into your comments, maybe you already have them there, so I apologize to be presumptuous, but, the LAO in the note about what constitutes a project talks about this challenge, and I know it certainly is unique to the University of California, but this measure does not provide a definition for project. A proponent indicates that was intention because they want it litigated. It has its own risks in terms of having a chilling effect on the market. But he says, for example, a project could be limited to what is built on a given site at a specific time, such as an individual medical building, or could include larger systems of improvements construction over time, such as a medical center with multiple buildings. He was kind of raised earlier with respect to the testimony of the treasurer. Well, what if you had something that was even subsequently approved? Is that deemed part of the project? A broader definition of the project would result in more instances in which the $2 billion threshold is reached, thus triggering the measuring vote requirements. Accordingly, there's uncertainty regarding which projects government agencies and courts would determine are subject to the requirements of the measure. So the first question is about the notion of project. And again, what I'm concerned about that often happens in these hearings, and the message to the proponents here is, we have a document before us where where people have gathered signatures. That's the only thing that's probative and what the impact on California is going to be. The second argument is JPAs. The definition of projects, what it says is the measure states that joint power agencies or similar bodies created by states in which the state is a member. I don't know what a similar body is, but whatever that might be, this would likely include entities such as the Bay Toll Authority, the Orange County Transportation Corridors Agency, the Southern California Public Power Authority, which I distributed their numbers on, the Alameda Corridor Transportation Authority, to which the Secretary referred, the Sacramento Sanitation District's Financing Authority, the California Statewide Community Development, San Diego Facilities. In other words, these are entities in which the state is a party. And certainly one could say, well, it's not going to hit $2 billion as adjusted by inflation, but we don't know what that looks like. And so to the extent that those two issues, project and this notion of state entities, if you can help address that, because I think those go to some of the real squishiness that's written into this initiative and things that we should bring light to.